unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. Anti-colonial movements of the 20th century generated audacious ideas of freedom. After decolonization, however, the challenge was to give an institutional form to those radical ideas. Legalizing the Revolution, India and the Constitution of the Postcolony is a new book by the scholar Sandipto Das Gupta, which provides an innovative account of how India ultimately addressed this daunting challenge. It's a fresh, somewhat revisionist look at the making of the post-colonial constitutional order, and it tries to place the current crisis of liberal democracy in proper historical and conceptual context. Sundipto is an assistant professor of politics at the New School for Social Research, where he works on the history of modern political and social thought, especially the political theory of empire, decolonization, and post-colonial order. He is also a member of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton this academic year. To talk more about this book, I am pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Sandipto, it's so nice to see you after so long, and congrats on the book.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
So early on in the book, you sort of set up what I think are the stakes of this book. And I just want to read a passage from what you've written in the first few pages, which is that the first wager of this book is that the Constituent Assembly debates contribute to a political theory of decolonization, and that constitutions can tell us something about decolonization, and decolonization can tell us something about constitutions. And I wonder if maybe we can start there and tell us a little bit about the kind of larger conceptual framing of the book. What is the precise nature of that two-way interaction between these things, decolonization on the one hand and constitutions and constitutionalism on the other?
The mid-20th century decolonization, the end of modern European empires, which frees most of Asia and Africa, was also about the decade or two following that, say 45 to 65, was also the most productive period in history of constitution making, right? And by the time this gets over, about, from half to two-thirds of the world's constitution are written in this period, right? Yet when we think about it, when we write about constitutions, we do not necessarily always draw from the history of decolonization, right? There are two different sets of tools we bring to the table to understand A, constitutions, and B, decolonization. And they're separated in some senses analytically. So for constitutions, we generally look at legal theory, constitutional theory, which draws, especially in the post-war era, primarily from American constitutional experiences. It gives us kind of a template, a set of desirable norms every polity should aspire towards. And then we sort of try to see to what extent those norms have or have not been achieved, or the variations of them. And that's the way we think about them. And that often comes from, as I said, legal or constitutional scholars. And then for decolonization, there's different sets of questions, right? It's a question of, the problems of nation building, of development. What are the different kinds of, processes? Is it violent? Is it non-violent? Is it transfer of power? And for that, we bring sort of the instruments and tools of history, of social sciences, and try to understand those kinds of questions, right? Which there's a huge literature about. And somehow those two literatures has never really spoken with each other, right? And we sort of separate out constitutions from the history of decolonization. So my claim was we should think of post-colonial constitutions, in other words, constitutions made after decolonization, as not something as a kind of template which is being derived or not, but as this novel and challenging project of building institutions, right? Institutionalizing the decolonizing project, right? If you had an anti-colonial movement, you had these aspirations, you had these ideas of how will you have a country after it gains independence. The constitution-making process is the process of giving concrete institutional shape to those aspirations, right? And so to understand those constitutions, we can't start with the template of constitutional theory, but from this history of decolonization, right? So that's what I meant by the history of decolonization can and should tell us something about this distinctive project of post-colonial constitution making. And then on the other hand, I take that the Constitutional Assembly debates, which are, again, have generally been read to sort of find some abiding principles, or what are the main ways, say, Indians understand rights, Indian understands property, but actually think of them as this sort of contemporaneous record, right, of this specific challenge that they are facing of how to build institutions, how to institutionalize this post-colonial order. And so take that in that sense as an archive, right, of that challenge. And from that, try to get some insights, to get some analytical purchase on what was the unique challenges of decolonization and post-colonial nation building.
So, in this process of decolonization, right, there's often a kind of revolutionary fervor, revolutionary spirit. And one of the interesting things you point out is that in India, it wasn't as if there was a revolution to end, but there was one that the constitutional framers wanted to prevent. And you note that this kind of putative future revolution to be prevented could come in one of two forms. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what those two scenarios were that had preoccupied the framers during this period.
So let's just start with the usual story of constitutions, right? Which is the ideal typical story is basically this. You have a regime, people don't like the regime, they have a revolution, the regime is overturned, and now you have a new constitution. Right? So in other words, constitutions come at the end of revolution. The revolution overthrows a new regime, and then to the constitution, you build a new regime, right? That's the kind of sequence of events, revolutions followed by constitutions. The interesting thing I realized when I was reading the assembly debates actually is a couple of things. Firstly, and this is quite interesting, which is to see that the Congress, Indian National Congress, the main party of Indian independence movement, never ever talks of themselves as revolutionary. It's a word they never use. And they never use because there is a group of people that that they do talk about as revolutionaries, which are generally violent, small violent groups of, who commits something like, say, a Bhagat Singh, right? And who's called a Krantikari or revolutionary. And Congress sets themselves in contrast to that, right? And never actually uses the word revolutionary for themselves. And we talk about the independence movement, not the revolution. Right? And there's no Indian revolution. Yet, in the Constitutional Assembly, there is a lot of talk about revolutions. And it always kind of fascinated me why, right? And then always talking about revolution, as opposed to the story I just said about revolution followed by constitution, when they talk about revolution in the Assembly, they always talk about as in the future tense, right? As something that might happen. And as you just said, there are two versions that they kind of anticipate that might be happening, right? On one hand, you have this possibility that because there are still unfulfilled aspirations of the masses, which is primarily social and economic aspirations, right? In terms of inequality and poverty, unequal distribution of property against landlords, against factory owners, right? Which is kind of, you see that coming in the sort of the last 5 years preceding independence. You have strikes, you have peasant rebellions. And so that's the kind of vision, one of possible, of what you can call social disorder and sort of looming revolutionary social revolution that's possible if you do not address these needs or these demands of the masses. So that's one version, which is the revolution to be feared, right? It's outside of their control. It may just happen. And to counteract that, they argue, you need to perform another kind of revolution, which is a managed process of social transformation, right? And, there are these fascinating discussions that they have that basically to prevent the revolution of the first kind, which is sort of, this uncontrolled mass unrest, which can go who knows where, we need to do revolution, which still gets us a lot of necessary social transformation because the colonial social and economic order has to be changed, but we change it on our own terms, gradually and through a controlled manner. And much of the constitution-making process, I argue, is this dynamic between these two visions of revolution, right? And how to sort of supplant or prevent the first one with the second one.
And, the response to this challenge of trying to prevent a future revolution, as you put it, was a reconfiguration of the established kind of principles of the constitutional form, right? They had to reinterpret what constitutions can and should do. And you have a term for this, which is quite central to your book, which you call transformational constitutionalism. And I wonder if you could just kind of, for our listeners, unpack what you mean by that term.
Sure. So as I was saying earlier, right, so if the sequence now is changed from revolution followed by a constitution to a constitution followed by this gradual controlled process of, revolution and transformation, it actually inverts the process, right? and suddenly to rethink what a constitution can and should do. Because sort of the received wisdom about constitutions is that constitutions are about stability. It's about order, right? It's about preserving something, right? That we have now all agreed is a good thing. And that's how, think about Americans talking about they have a constitutional order for 250 years, right?
Right. And that allows you to kind of lock in a series of understandings or principles.
Exactly, right. While here now, you're thinking about a constitutional order, which is not about, or a constitutional system, sorry, which is not about preserving a certain kind of order, right? But about facilitating change. Now, that makes you rethink actually a lot of the elements of the Constitution. And the second part of the book, I kind of go through institution by institution, something like, say, parliamentarism, idea of rights, judicial review, property, labor, all of those things, and you can see how they are reconfigured. Now, the point is not to sort of, impose a particular consensus that you have achieved, but to facilitate change, right? And that's the process I call transformational constitutionalism, which I think is quite distinctive in the way of thinking about what constitutions can and should do, and which I argue is not just, I think India had one of the most developed forms of that, but it's a similar sort of challenges, a similar project, I think, which is shared by many other newly decolonized countries.
So, one of the things that we think about when we think about constitutionalism, right, is essentially the institutional form the society or polity will take. And you have this really interesting line that really stuck with me, where you say the post-colonial constitution in India didn't design the state. It was designed around the state. And if I could just push you on this for a second, is this basically a reference to the fact that, look, we know that much of the Constitution bore a striking resemblance to the Government of India Act of 1935, which was enacted under British colonial rule, and as a result bore a lot of these hallmarks? Or are you making a deeper point about what the Constitution had to grapple with?
It's the second, and I think often we kind of it's a striking fact that 2/3 of the Constitution is a direct copy of this colonial document, right? But I think we often sort of just end with that, sort of get lost just with that fact of, oh, look, there's a resemblance, right?
Right. You sort of take a line here and say, look, it's the same line here.
Yeah. But I think that's more of like the sort of the symptom than the cause. I'm sorry, it's more of the outcome than the cause of the symptom, right? Which is to say that what the real interesting thing here is that Congress becomes a real challenge to British rule when it becomes a mass movement under Gandhi, right? After the First World War. Till then, it's sort of a smaller group of lawyers and civil servants petitioning the state, but it's not taken that seriously. It's only really after it becomes a mass movement does it become a sort of potential claimant for power, and we can kind of see the end of colonial rule on the horizon, right? And when that happens, by the end of 1930s, when Congress really is this sort of mass India-wide, highly organized, massive party, and they're extremely successful in the mass mobilization part, there is an anxiety amongst the Congress leadership, at least certain sections of the Congress leadership, right, which worries that this actually is going to there's this inherent tendency of radicalization of the mass movement, right, which can take you much farther than when you want to go. And so then there's a shift, and I think that the turning point for me really is the elections that the Congress does take part in under the Government of India Act, right, in the late 30s. And that election, not just the election Congress, which Congress wins, which one can expect, but also accepts office. And for the first time, Congress enters government, even if it's government with much limited powers, but the first time Congress enters government. And what I argue is that the terrain of the anti-colonial movement shifts, especially for the Congress, from the streets where they were so far to the government houses. And you start to kind of imagine your entire project of what would it mean to end colonial rule, build something new around the state. The state provides the instruments, the grammar through which now you're imagining a new India, right? So it becomes a central kind of mode of anti-colonial politics and post-colonial making. So this is the first point. So there's a very important shift in the nature of the anti-colonial movement, making it deeply state-centric. And so then once you have the transfer of power and the Congress sort of inherits the state mechanisms pretty much, in pristine condition. Because there's no revolution, no one smashes up the state. You have the exact same personnel, you have all the same, norms and laws and everything else, right? Which they maintain. Again, which is also quite a remarkable fact that maintain the same police officers.
And there was obviously a debate and discussion around this with many people, leaders of the Congress, arguing that we should not try and rock the boat at this moment, right?
Absolutely.
That we essentially take the colonial bureaucracy, the ICS, turn it into IS, and so on and so forth.
Which is a controversial thing, because some of these people are the ones who were imprisoning you, 2 years ago, right? The same Congress leaders. So there is but Vallabhbhai Patel is the one who sort of insists on this most on this sort of continuity. And so what then becomes, and the line you're coming to about it's the constitution being built around the state sort of remains, as an instrument, right? Something that they value, they want to keep, and that's what they want to use to achieve this second revolution, this good revolution of gradual controlled social change. So we are not going to rewrite the state, reimagine the state, start from scratch, or ask the question, who all will be the protagonist of this new change process? We already have those questions answered. The state is already there. Now, with that given, let us try to figure out what are the best mechanisms we can have to kind of facilitate that state, this new, the state that we have inherited, the old machine with a new owner, so to speak, right, to do its job. And so that's what I meant by saying the Constitution does not necessarily kind of, rework the state. It sort of tries to reorient its objectives or its tasks towards, say, from repression and maintaining order, which is the colonial rule, to development and transformation, which is their goal now.
So I'm glad that you brought in the Congress Party, because I wanted to kind of ask you about their role, right? I mean, we tend to think of the Congress as enjoying this deep reservoir of popular goodwill, as the vanguard of the kind of independence movement. But you note that, in kind of constitutional history of India, there's a sort of assumed representational unity between the Congress and the people. And in your telling, in your book, the relationship between the Congress and the people is a kind of ambiguous and somewhat contentious one, right? So I guess in your retelling of the story, in what ways was the kind of representational unity lacking?
Now, that's a great question, and that sort of gets to the heart of the way I want to understand the anti-colonial movement leading up to the Constitution, and which I believe gives the Constitution its unique character, which is, it is no doubt that Congress is a truly mass party. I think if you look in world history, maybe there has been no other party which has had that sort of a genuine mass support. They have an extraordinary organization which goes to every single district in India. They have true mass participation and mobilization capacity. So all of that is very true. I'm not going to say Congress is, and that sort of, I think, sets them apart from some other kinds of examples, other kind of countries, which is purely sort of an elite capture after decolonization, right? So Congress is a mass party. I think for me, the more interesting thing is precisely because they're so successful as a mass party is what makes them so anxious, right? In other words, because they're able to politicize the masses so well, especially in the 1930s after the Great Depression, and the Congress movements really spread. Masses are really, especially the peasant masses, are really participating in the Congress. Because they're so successful, they now suddenly have on their hand a deeply politicized masses who have kind of, muscle memory and organizational sort of, training for political participation. And with that also comes higher aspirations, right? Like this is a common phenomenon in every mass movement, that the more you're politicized, the more your demand, its sort of horizons of your aspirations go up. And in the case of India, what sort of concerns them is this move beyond just opposition to foreign political rule to certain forms of economic demands, which comes up, right? And this, especially in the late 30s, early 40s, you get this across the country. And so that then Congress has this interesting dilemma, which on the one hand, Congress's entire sort of, claim for power against the British, or the claim for legitimacy against the British, is based on the fact that they have genuine popular support, right? Gandhi keeps saying again and again in the Roundtable Conference that I represent Indian people, right? Congress is the only party which represents Indian people truly, and is more or less correct on that. But on the other hand, they have this anxiety about what really the people who they have now brought into the political arena can do and can want, right? So it's this kind of interesting simultaneous dependence on and anxiety about the people, right? Which is this, so Congress never kind of, says, no democracy in India, we can't have democracy. They have to commit to democracy. They have to commit to universal franchise, which is why in India we have universal franchise at one go in a country where the vast majority can't read or write, don't have property. They go for universal franchise straight away, which is extraordinarily remarkable in political history. It's because they can't now turn back and say this is a popular party that, oh, no, the people can't actually rule themselves. At the very same time, they also share this deep anxiety, right, about popular movement, which they themselves have generated. So you have this very, very interesting set of dynamic which play out, not just in the Constitution, but outside of it. I just give an example in one of the chapters is that all the Congress state governments, and this is even before the provincial governments, before the Constitution come to force, start adopting all the British laws about, curfew and Section 114, like all the ones, about crowd management. And when the opposition parties say, well, you were the ones who were against these acts till yesterday, this was against you, it was against you, what is going on? Because now there's suddenly this, anxiety about what popular movements can do. So it's a very, very interesting, I think, dilemma. It's not to say, I think either, which has been some tendency, I think, in Indian literature, to say, oh, no, Congress is an elite party. I think that's wrong. Or to say Congress is purely a popular party, there's no tension, it speaks for the people of the time. That's wrong too. I think what's really interesting, I think what gives the Constitution its unique character is this push and pull, right, between dependence on the people and anxiety about them.
Well, so let's just pause on this push and pull, right? Because when you talk about Gandhi and the role he played, right? I mean, obviously, in any telling of this period, Gandhi gets a lot of credit for transforming the Congress from an elite party of lawyers, as you mentioned, to a genuine mass movement. But you do have this very interesting note in the book where you say, look, while Gandhian politics would successfully overcome many of the shortcomings of the early anti-colonial movement, it couldn't fully extinguish them, right? So I wonder if we could just pause on that for a second. What in your mind kind of stopped this complete transformation from taking place?
I think we really should spend a second to acknowledge how extraordinary a figure Gandhi is. I think that, again, nobody else managed to bridge this gap between, because there had been other attempts earlier. The Swadeshi movement in Bengal, for example, a good attempt, which falls apart precisely because the elites and the masses don't have a common language they share, right? And so Gandhi's enormous achievement, and this is where his unique distinctive techniques, his distinctive language, the way he presents himself all comes in, is being able to create this bridge, right? And not just create this bridge one time, but to maintain it over a long period of time, right? And this kind of peace between, on one hand, he has Birla, who is, his supporter. On the other hand, the landless peasants in UP look up to Gandhi for guidance, right? So that's an extraordinary achievement which he maintains. Nevertheless, it's a hard task, precisely because there's such stark contrasts, right? In terms of the coalition is so large, and there's such stark contrast in the very sort of material interest in some cases between these two poles, right? That to the extent when in the early stages, when it's really focused on the British, right, that kind of papers over these distinctions. But as actually independence comes closer and it becomes a question of when and not if, right, those other demands then start sort of filtering up. And this is a great example of that is the Quit India movement. And if you look at the Quit India movement, precisely because the Congress leadership is removed from the scene very early on, you see all these kind of organic forms of the movement, many of which Congress would not have sanctioned at all, right? And they sort of, take form. So, and you see that in Gandhi very well. Like this, a lot of Gandhi's correspondences, from the 30s onwards, is about trying to explain to peasants why they should not, rebel against the landlords, trying to explain the landlords why they should treat the peasants a bit better, treat them like their children. Same thing with, factory owners and workers. And he tries, and especially in the question of caste, which is his main attempt at the end of his life, right? To try to bridge these big social divides. And he thinks he can do that through kind of intensify the movement. But you can really see almost, more than half or maybe even 2/3 of Gandhi's energy in the last, say, 10, 15 years goes in trying to figure out the internal contradictions within the movement rather than India versus England, the kind of, the classic version of it, right? So that's and so that pretty much becomes the main task for Gandhi and the Congress, really. And I think to me, often the story, as you correctly said, especially for the Constitution, we kind of have this story about, okay, the British had India, Congress opposed them, now Congress, rules India, right? It's kind of a simple 3-part story where the main conflict is British versus Indians, right? To me, I think the much more analytically significant one, right, which is, I think, much more significant for the way the post-colonial institutions were structured or post-colonial political life was developed, was this internal contest, right, between the masses and the large, mostly peasant masses, and the elites in the Congress leadership.
Hey, Granthamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Granthamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Well, so let's now kind of bring Nehru into this conversation, right? Because you can't really talk about this period without talking about Nehru as well, right? And there you trace a very interesting evolution in Nehru's own thinking, right? Which is, you say that kind of between the years roughly of 1940, 1947, the independence moment, Nehru had his own change of heart, right? After 1947, he was no longer willing to fight for, publicly advocate for a popular process, or you could say democratic or grassroots process of constitution making, right? And instead kind of continued on a more elite driven or top down driven path. And I wonder if you could describe for us, what happened in that intervening almost decade-long period to change Nehru's outlook from saying, this idea of a popular process of constitutional making is just not practical. We have to go a different route. What motivated him?
So, this is the question, I think, in all Nehru scholarship. I think this is the main kind of, question for the great sort of the S. Gopal 3-volume biography of Nehru. I think this is a lot of the writings that D.D. Kosambi is writing on Nehru. A lot of the contemporary writing on Nehru is about this, what happened to Nehru, right? And I think, to me, I don't have, maybe the exact correct answer, but I have some suggestions, I guess, that to think of him as this. It's a really fascinating, and to me, the most fascinating character in the story, because you're right. He is the one who is one of the part of this young, more left-wing group in Congress, which emerges from the early 30s, especially as the movement turns more radical after the Great Depression. His public statements consistently makes the argument that it has to be independence, has to be through mass movement, not negotiation. He talks about again and again and again about, and I sort of quote him, that the Constituent Assembly has to be a popular assembly chosen by popular vote. He's also against the office acceptance by Congress in the elections, because he wants to stay outside of the office. So this is Nehru's consistent. And then if we see, two things happen. I mean, one is he does lose the power struggle within the Congress quite decisively. I think the office acceptance question is the one where he gives the speech against it, and he loses the vote in the Congress Working Committee, right? And the new Congress right, as they were called, Vallabhbhai Patel being the main one, but also Rajagopalachari, Rajendra Prasad, he loses the internal Congress battle to them, right? Now then, but he nevertheless is the most popular figure in Congress. He's the one who goes for all the campaigns, right? That's why he's seen as the successor to Gandhi as the Congress leadership. Never is it in doubt that he's going to be the next prime minister when India becomes independent. So he is the most popular figure, right? So at this time, and S. Gopal sort of narrates this, and you can see this in Jayaprakash Narayan, who was his kind of very close political ally, called the Congress Socialists, who basically tell him that the Congress party has been taken over by these people. You should break up with us, come out with us, and form a socialist party or campaign. And with your name, we can succeed. And that's something Nehru never does, right? So then he always kind of, makes the point that, no, we have to work it through the party, right? I'm never going to sort of break away from the party. He also has a deep, I think, personal affection and loyalty to Gandhi. So with all of those things, I think that question of what Nehru, why it did not break out, I think is an extraordinarily important one, because after Gandhi, the person who kinds of guarantees this coalition last is Nehru, because he has, and there's a question people often ask, why did Gandhi choose Nehru and not Patel, who had way more organizational support within the Congress than Nehru did, right? And as his successor. Because the main challenge to the Congress at that time was not from the right, right? Because the Hindu right or the RSS are not really a serious party, but from the left, right? And Nehru is the one who kind of maintains a left flank in some senses, retains Congress as this popular party with all this kind of larger plans, from the Karachi Resolution onwards of social rights and so on, while maintaining some kind of an institutional organizational continuity, right? And he's the person who does that. And there's a lot of questions which are asked. And Nehru, I think this continues throughout his life. Then that's why after he becomes prime minister, he again realized that the Congress is not really his party, especially at the organizational level. He loses many of organizational battles in the Congress, and which is why he kind of retreats back to the state, and he kind of, really surrounds himself with like technocrats and bureaucrats, because he can't go through the party anymore. He feels he lost the party. And that's something which happens from the late 30s onwards. Why he never goes outside of the party, why he never kind of tries to make that sort of a claim, I think is a very, very interesting one. I think it's part of which it's temperament. He's not a populist temperamental person. I think he's a very much institutional person. He really has kind of a faith in certain kinds of norms and rules of institutions and democracy. And he wants to work all those things through the Congress. He believes that his arguments are right, that we need a certain kind of social transformation, and it will have to happen once we have democracy. And so he, in some senses, never pulls the trigger, so to speak, and goes all the way when the moment of decision arrives in the end of 30s, early 40s, right? But I think it's what makes him a really fascinating character, just in terms of, if you want to write a novel as a figure, as his internal, tensions and to figure it out, and he's taking these long walks in his corridors, as Gopal says, always has this sense of the weight of the world on him. He is the figure, and I think but in him you see this larger tension I'm talking about between sort of the mass movement and the institutions, right, which is playing out. But Nehru kind of, very dramatically internalizes that tension.
Well, let me ask you about this tension in a slightly different domain, which is the kind of economic realm, right? And maybe kind of located in this decision to embark on a planned economy. You have a very interesting chapter where you talk about some of the decisions that went into, this idea that we needed to have kind of state-directed development of a certain kind. And I just want to quote something you write in that section. You say that making production the primary focus of development was not a technical matter. The sequence of objectives implied a certain sequence of politics. The carefully calibrated project of development and planning could be the solution. It could achieve change without the attendant tumult, right? And so I wonder if we could just kind of, move a little bit from the political to economic. How and why did India's leaders, Nehru included, believe planning would kind of forestall the revolution?
Right. Because I think some of it's in the air, right? Like every country, we think of planning today as a socialist thing. Everybody, there's a Marshall Plan, there's there's Beveridge Plan, there's a plan. Every country, everywhere has a plan, because that's what's the
right. It's sort of in the zeitgeist
everywhere, right? And it's also the hype onto the Keynesian economics idea that states can intervene, that states do have this particular knowledge, markets don't always function rationally. This is very much so that's very much a part of it, really. It's not something unique to India, the notion of planning and development. But it's also kind of, linked to this notion that, right, okay, so can be two kind of, if you want to, let's say, the social order as it is now, and it has sort of entrenched, power bases and structures, and you want to change that. There's really two actors which can do that, right? Either you do it through a popular movement, a mass movement, you go in, you have these protests of cadre-based parties which is tumultuous, it's often violent. or you do it through the state. State is the only actor which is powerful enough, right, has the capacity to challenge these entrenched social powers. And so if the state has to do that, then it needs to have a plan. It needs to have a coordinated machine, or sort of a structure, sort of, through which they can do that, right? And to do that, also to have a kind of an objective set up. And the objective they set for themselves, because you can go in different directions. So the objective is not one of, let's say, justice or equity. It's not about, distributional kind of, some concerns about, someone has too much, too little. They consistently justify it on the name of growth, right? That actually you need to end landlordism, because landlordism actually, is bad for capitalist growth, and which it's true, it is, right? Like if you have landlords, it stops investment, it's unproductive, and so on. That's the kind of argument they make, rather than by saying, no, it's sort of, unjust, or it's sort of, unequal, and so on. And so so both the state as the actor which does that, and the ideological basis of that is not necessarily some kind of, argument of justice or equity, but that of nation building, right? National development, growth needs to create some kind of industrialization, some kinds of sort of, even like a base of capital. The state comes in because the state is the only one which can raise capital in this context. The Indian, industrial firms are not powerful enough to raise the amount of capital to raise to actually invest in the economy. So all of those becomes a primary way they understand the project, right? As opposed to it in other ways. And I think that sort of matters. I think that sequence, which is that first we grow, then we talk about distribution, right? And that matters in the way they go about it, matters in the way they justify it. And they matter, I think, very importantly, how people understand it. And they don't understand necessarily the planning process in a popular sense as something that is there to give them justice or, freedom and true freedom after independence, but actually to, as a much more kind of rational technocratic project of economic growth.
So you have a series of interesting examinations of various institutions, right? And including Parliament. And you say something pretty provocative about Parliament that I just wanted to kind of unpack, and I think will be interesting for our listeners. You say that when it came down to it, India's constitution makers settled for the role of an accomplice for the parliament. But over the years, Parliament would not succeed in even playing that role, right? So in your view, explain to us why Parliament failed even to live up to this kind of minimalist role as an accomplice to power.
So the question there was, if you want to do this sort of planned development, right, what is the best institution to do it through? Now, the commonsensical answer in world history has always been the executive. The executive has, it's more centralized, it's more effective, it's going to go to deliberation, right? It has the tools to go in and intervene. And to me, what was fascinating and really, really remarkable about the Indian Constitution is that they chose the parliament to be that. This is a, very strongly anti-presidential constitution. They discuss this option and they reject that option, right? And for various reasons, I go into the book, but they actually feel that actually a president, which is kind of an all or nothing system, right? Because the president, that's one person. There's no other. While parliamentary systems have an inherent tendency, there's kind of inbuilt mechanism of negotiation, of cooperation, because you have to kind of work with multiple parties rather than one person doing what they want to do, right? And for a country as complicated and diverse as India, with so many contending social groups, parliament is the best way to actually achieve this without us falling back into some kind of this social unrest and tumult which they worry about, right? And that's actually quite a remarkable thing, because again, that's not how most kind of state-led developmental plans go. They generally tend towards, think of all the from, Bismarck in Germany onwards, it's really generally kind of strengthens a strong executive. And I think it's not only it's an interesting one, I think it's also a more democratic one, actually. I think it sort of actually creates a much more mechanism where between sort of, the level of the popular level and the technocratic level, there's enough sort of mediation and filter through the parliamentary, the members of parliament, that actually both can hear each other's voices better, right? Which is you don't normally get if you have an executive which is technocrats going in and doing their things. So it allows for even a more democratic form of developmental projects, I think. So it's actually, I think, quite a novel and interesting one, right? And the idea, therefore, is the parliament, the MPs are the ones who are going to sort of mediate this process by having this conversation, tell the people why this is a good thing for them, and then tell the technocrats what they need, what the people are demanding, what the needs are, right? So kind of act this mediation. Except what I think the failure of the parliamentary project in India, and I think we kind of see that, right? The parliament in India, from what it began in the 50s, is the most powerful institution, actually. Now, it's kind of just the ones which you hardly have discussions, rubber stamps most laws, really an executive, where the PMO is where the most of the power is. That's been the case for the last, say, 20 years or so, right? This decline, I think, is because, again, going back to the earlier story, this sort of fear of popular political participation makes parliament kind of, the kind of engagement it required with popular politics, right? To make it truly this institution which can then mediate it upwards to the level of the state, to actually parliament become what it is now, which is just sort of a number counting game for who will get executive power. What we really care about is who will get executive power, and parliament is just a way towards that. Right. And so the parliamentary MPs are not someone who come out of popular movements or have some deep relationship with them, but just bear a party symbol, more or less, often. Right. Or at least the way they function. And that's why they always vote,
And that, I mean, essentially it turns into a mathematical equation, right? If you are the party or the coalition that gets more than half the number of the 543 members of parliament, then you control the executive, and the executive does everything. Parliament just essentially becomes redundant.
And which is why you also in every party, and even regional parties, you have this one powerful figure, right? And everybody's actually voting for that figure rather than their local MPs or MLAs, with some exceptions. And I think this is I think the larger point, maybe we can get back to it also later, if we're saying on democracy. I think there is a kind of narrowing down of democracy to pure electoral arithmetic, right? Democracy, as much a robust idea of public participation in politics, is kind of narrowed down to just the idea of electoral calculation, right? And the parliament, which actually, that's their main source of legitimacy, is that we are the ones who speak with the people and we are the ones chosen by them. So we should be listened to the most, right? No one chose you as a prime minister directly. They chose us and we chose you, right? And so kind of once parliament loses that connection, they lose that authority, right? Which they could exercise over the executive earlier. And which I think is the way the constitution was designed, actually. Because I'll end on this just one point, because if you think about this, the colonial rule was an executive rule. It was the most powerful executive in the world. And that's what they're going against. They don't want another new viceroy, right? They want to have this kind of figure with the parliament, which looks a bit like the Congress, where you can have all the different interests coming together, different regions, and sort of talk it out. Right. But precisely because they don't want to have this talk it out, the conversation beyond the parliamentary walls, all the way to the popular political fear, because of the fear of popular politics, they lose that authority and legitimacy over time.
I mean, just really fascinating to think about, because, what you're pointing to is this kind of path dependency, right? I mean, decisions taken so long ago, and you're seeing the very real impacts even today, right? As we think about Parliament, the data is very clear on the declining number of bills that are passed, the number of sittings, the number of productive time, the power that the anti-defection law has, essentially to further hollow out whatever agency independent legislators might have, right? I mean,
standing committees, they would have this detailed report of, if you look at the standing committee reports in the 50s and 60s, they're like detailed reports, which, how they look through laws, and which, now it's just a pro forma thing, basically.
So let me try to kind of bring this to a close by pulling together a few threads, and also trying to bring us to the kind of present moment, right? And in the concluding chapter, you kind of gesture at, where India is circa 2024, 2025, by saying there are a lot of political analyses of India which find in this particular moment, majoritarian excesses of democracy. And you say very pointedly, it was not the excess of democracy, but its scarcity that led us to our current moment. I mean, we're so used to hearing people talking both in India and outside about, well, if only we kind of had a little bit less democracy, if we could be a bit more orderly like China or like the East Asian countries, we would be able to solve all these problems. I wonder if we could just kind of conclude with this, which is, in what ways in your mind is the current political moment a reflection of an absence
Right.
rather than an abundance of democracy?
Because I think, we tend to think about democracy quantitatively, right? How many people can vote? How often are the elections? Are they free and fair? It's just a question about
How many parties? What's the
Right.
turnout? So on.
It's always about how many rather than, how much of participation there is, right? And it's a qualitative idea of democracy. And that is not something I'm importing from, like my kind of wish list. It's actually what one saw with the anti-colonial movement, right? We saw actually deep mass participation, mass political education, kind of, demands, working through leaders, movement building, organizational building. And that idea of democracy, much a robust idea of democracy, which had one very important element to it, which is what I want to maybe focus on, which is that one of the main claims the British had in India, right, is that the Indians are not a unified entity. They are a bunch of group of different religions and castes. And if we leave, they will all kill each other, right? This was the classic argument always that the only thing which keeps India unified is British rule, because they're thing called Indian. There are Hindus and there are Muslims and there are castes and there are religions and regions. And the Congress is saying, no, there is an Indian. We are building it. Look at us. Like there are all these different groups coming together on the streets. This is what, we are building as this new identity, political identity of what it means to be an Indian, right? Going beyond what you were born as, right? And so in other words, deeper political participation allows for new political identities to be formed, right? Which is based on politics and not what you were given, right? So British are saying all the identity you have is the one you were given. You inherited it. While the anti-colonial movement's argument is, no, we actually make it. We make it through our political participation, through our political activity. We become a new subject, right? Who thinks of themselves as Indian in this particular case. And if you don't have, the reverse of that would be the less of political participation you have, you kind of keep falling back on these inherited identities, which was given from the colonial times onwards, right? And that's kind of what you see when I say the kind of, the narrowing down of democracy into just electoralism, right? It's the kind of becomes, again, a game of numbers. And then it becomes which kind of groups who, often will go to their own representative because they're the only ones they trust. That's the only kind of form of politics it becomes, very much similar in some senses to what was there in the colonial era. Democracy becomes an arithmetic process, right? Rather than some kind of, process which transforms you in the process of participating in democracy into something new, a new kind of subject, to something which actually kind of makes you fall back on your given identities, your name, basically, right? I think that's what I meant. I think that gave us, so it's kind of this really focus on democracy as election, just this identity which we have, very close identity, made democracy an arithmetic. And then it becomes which is the party which is able to, garner the most numbers, and that's what majoritarianism really is that it's about, who has the best sort of methods to kind of, gather together the most numbers on what crowns. And I think that's actually comes about because democracy there's not enough for robust political participation. People don't actually see themselves in the state. All they see is state as this transactional thing. If we send our guy there, they can get us certain things rather than something that we are a part of, that we are, which is built by us, which, so I think that's what I mean by this, the qualitative lack of democracy and therefore a quantitative gap is what creates this particular situation, right? Where democracy is understood as a arithmetic and be completely a transactional thing between the state and me, right? And every 5 years, I can have these things, what I can get and not get, right? From the state. I think that's what gets us to this present moment. And then that's, I think, to me, particularly hard because, you have this great legacy of democratic participation. And there are moments in Indian history. Think about the JP movement, which is sort of, consciously draws from that legacy of anti-colonial movement, right? To kind of bring people to the streets and kind of think about, and that was sort of one of the kind of great democratizing moments in Indian politics again, which sort of renews in a democracy very importantly. I think the lack of that is what gets us here. And just a quick question on the China, which often happens. This is a bit separate from this point, which I think the constitution makers sort of understand this point, which is that India is not China in two very important ways, right? One is it still remains a much more complicated set of, if you do try to do something like that, it wouldn't hold together. And it wouldn't have held together then, it wouldn't hold together today. It's not that because Indians, elites were particularly enlightened that they said, no, we should have. They also realized there was no one particular group or party which could dominate the Indian social scene, right? The way you could have in China for various historical reasons to do with the nature of Chinese state and the Chinese elites and so on, right? So it's something, the idea of the parliamentary form, you bring together others for the form of development, right? It's not just that that's what they say. It's not just that it's a good thing to do. It's also the smart thing to do, right? And I think that's what also maintains, in some senses, India's potential to actually properly grow and actually properly have political participation in its growth. And I think the withdrawal from that, right, is not, again, it's just not an ethical argument about that. I think it's also, in just terms of practically speaking, not the best.
Right, it's a pragmatic one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just to underscore one thing you said before we end, Sandipto, which is that, when you were reflecting on the current majoritarian moment,
right,
everything that you said in your response is in a way equally applicable to Modi and the BJP, as well as the opposition, right? Now, the axis of the cleavage may be different. It may be religion in the case of the BJP, and it may be caste, for instance, and if you listen to what Rahul Gandhi is saying lately. But the majoritarian kind of logic and the, again, if I have enough things and my guy gets there and he does, it's a very numerical and / transactional way of looking at things.
I mean, I think that's the two kind of main modes of opposition to Modi. I think both of it misses this point. One is the liberal moment, which is, we should have these rights, the constitution, the courts should help us, which I think is an important thing. Obviously, there's no doubt about that. But that's not going to be enough, right? And the other one is to sort of say, oh, no, we can find a different arithmetic against his arithmetic. But if you're still playing on his terrain, and the one that he plays on, notion of the Hindu, is just the biggest number, right? So he has an advantage in that.
Right. I mean, it's an 80-20 game.
Right. So if you have to change the game, the rules of the game itself, you can't just say that, no, I will just, do this, or say that, no, he's not keeping his own promises, therefore we are better. Like, those are not the way to think about it. Is to sort of think about, say that to what extent is his regime undemocratic. It has its oligarchic tendencies. It doesn't talk to the people. It sort of has this distance from the people. Those are the ways, the very Gandhian ways, the very JP way. That's how JP went against Indira Gandhi, as saying they sort of cut off, small coteries from the country without. That's how you have to go after him, right? By talking about, the nature of what kind of democracy that he claims, because he always claims, that he's correct. He's the lawful winner of elections, but you have to tell that that's not what democracy necessarily means. This is the way it functions, the way he operates, the way he's distant from the people. That's the way it has to be, rather than saying, oh, we have a better formula than he has.
My guest on the show this week is Sandipto Dasgupta. He's an assistant professor of politics at the New School for Social Research. He's also spending the year at the Institute of the Advanced Study at Princeton. He is the author of the brand new book, Legalizing the Revolution, India and the Constitution of the Postcolony. Samuel Moyn at Yale has said that this account of the origins of the Indian Constitution is nothing short of heroic, and its relevance to our global present is plain. Sandipto, it was really a delight to read this book. I mean, you kind of, I think, you really tug at people's priors that we have about this period, about the Constitution, and force us to kind of look at things in a very new perspective. Congrats on all of the work, and thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much. It was a great conversation. Thank you very much for having me.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production, brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.